Hey gang, what is up? Hope your world is good. This video is all about clamps, clamping storage, tips and tricks on clamps, and so much more. Let's jump right in. You ever need to increase the pressure of those squeeze clamps? Just put one inside the other. Bam, done. I find it really helpful to have different types of clamps. So I've got your regular old pony Jorgensen pipe clamps, right? And then I've got these aluminum bar clamps. You can see those there. I got those years ago from Hartville Tool, I believe. They have some similar at Harbor Freight, but they are not the same quality. These are pretty good clamps. They're lightweight. But anyway, I have those, and then of course some of these parallel jaw, a Jorgensen, a couple of Jorgensen and Bessie also. And those I like because they have a deeper reach, and they can go, in this situation, across or over those other clamps, right? And then the beauty of a bar clamp, or a pipe clamp I should say, is that it's round, and you can see one clamping head is oriented this direction and the other one is down here. Turn 90 degrees to that to clamp underneath the bench. Hey, so I wanted to show you these clamps. I've done a couple of modifications to them. I know a lot of people put wood in these, but I haven't needed to do that. If I need a stronger, heavier duty clamp, I'll use a pipe clamp or an I-beam clamp. But anyway, on these, I've added a little sheet metal screw here to keep that from coming off the end. If I need to take it off, I can just pull the screw, right? And then added some leather to these plastic pads. Even though it's plastic, on some species, those plastic pads will still dent the work. And then on this Acme thread, I use some of this stuff just to make that, action a little smoother. But yeah, these are fantastic. So I have these in a 4-footer. I think this will accommodate about 49 inches. And then these are 2-footers, and they'll handle up to about 25 and a half, I think. But yeah, I love these clamps. Super lightweight, but strong enough to pull a joint together. And they don't distort your work from the weight of the clamp. All right, so this might look like a big mess because it kind of is. But I'm clamping up a frame, and these are really effective, right? These clamping cowls. So this one is, you can see it's for a 22.5 degree or a 45 degree miter. This one has a 45 degree cut, so you can clamp straight across. I've got one on each adjacent edge over there, right? And then here, I'm just using one of these notched blocks. And these are plastic, but you can make them out of wood pretty easy. I like these out of plastic because if you get any glue on them, they're not going to stick. They're not going to bond. And then more plastic, top and bottom, immersed right in that glue. And then when I pull this clamp off after a couple of hours or whatever, this plastic, polypropylene, polyethylene, polystyrene, something like that, it'll pop right off. But yeah, it's a very effective way to pull a miter together. I'll do a close-up on these other corners. First and foremost is this cowl here. You can see it's clamped there out of the way of the miter, one on each adjacent edge. And then this clamp, of course, draws everything together. In addition, these dudes hold a lot better if you put sandpaper on them. So it'll grab against the surface of the frame. If it doesn't matter, you can even add screws. That's not always going to be applicable, but for whatever this project was, it looks like I had pre-drilled some holes so I could screw that directly to the edge or whatever I was clamping. So I'm adding these solid wood pieces to the ends of these curved components, right? And they need to be, I don't want them to move once I glue them. So I made these pieces, and at first I was going to label them rights and lefts. This is the right side and this is the left side. But in fact, I can use the same piece. So I've added some clear tape here to prevent the glue from sticking. I can put this just sticking out slightly, something like that. I'm going to pin this in place with some 23 gauge pins, and then when this piece goes on, it'll prevent this piece from sliding, and it'll give me the appropriate angle here and here where my thumb is. Does that make sense? On this side, I can put a piece of plastic just to keep this piece flush and keep it from sliding. And then I can put another one of these pinned in place, and that'll give me my clamping area. Should work. All right, so the reason that I couldn't pin those Wenge blocks into place is because these are drawer fronts, and that angle corresponds with the angle on the table skirt. And at some point, I will have to adjust that, probably with a hand plane, so I didn't want any pins on those blocks. Over the years, I've noticed that a lot of times I'll have a favorite clamp, but I won't just buy all my clamps that size. I like different brands, different styles. This is a smaller clamp. You can see I would have a hard time putting a clamp this size in here. It's going to be heavier. The head here would be bigger. So lots of different styles of clamps, different brands. Makes sense to me. You always hear people saying you can never have enough clamps. Well, you can never have enough styles or types of clamps either, right? Well, of course, this worked out perfectly. The little bit of time it took to make those clamping cowls to keep my target pieces from shifting around was well worth it. And it also gave me that appropriate angle to put a clamp across the two pieces. Those tiny little nail holes or pinholes, I think those are, what, 23 gauge? Those are insignificant, especially on the back of a drawer. I mean, I suppose you could fill those. I didn't bother. And then my entire family and my brothers were like, what are these little holes on the... I'm kidding. All right, so here's a good shot of those curved drawer fronts in all their glory. All right, so this has been sitting for about 5 minutes, okay? And I may have mentioned this somewhere else in the video, but after it's been sitting, I like to come back and just give these just a little bit of a twist. As that glue compresses, you can notice that your clamps will start to loosen just a little bit. So I don't know if it makes any difference. It makes me feel better. That's what I do. And the other thing you'll notice that I probably don't need this many clamps, but I'm the kind of guy that likes lots of clamps with moderate pressure rather than just a few clamps with a ton of pressure. For instance, this clamp here, if you were to draw an imaginary 90-degree force of clamping pressure, you can see that I have a lot of overlap with all these clamps. So that tells me that I'm going to have adequate clamping pressure on the entire panel. So yeah, makes sense to me. All right, listen to this. Here's something to think about. When I put my F-style clamps away, I like to thread the handle out where about 10 millimeters or 3/8 of an inch of the Acme thread is showing. That way it's ready to clamp. Oftentimes, if in this situation here, it's out too far and I could run out of clamping pressure. And if it's retracted all the way back, sometimes you run into the situation where you need a little more slack quickly and you don't have it. So it's just a little habit I do, and it makes a lot of difference when you're in a mad dash to clamp something up. Here we go. Perfect. So here's a key point that may be well known already. I've got this screw part of my clamps directly in the center of this panel, right? So you can see I've got a space here. So if your clamp's underneath or on top, you just need to make sure that that screw part is centered in the panel, and that'll keep it from bowing or cupping as you apply that pressure. I like to release my clamps by twisting them in favor of releasing them because they are pretty tight, and just by turning the handle, it's sometimes tricky, especially if you can't get your knuckles in there. This little habit is super useful, very effective, and yeah, it may be well known, but maybe it'll help somebody out there. I don't always use my vacuum bag. Sometimes just blocks, cowls, and clamps are easier, yeah? So I'm adding these little strips in here, and I have a stop, right? Just clamping it once I add a little bit of glue. And the way I place my clamps matters. So let me grab a piece of wood here. Mi scusi. If the hinge or the center of the hinge is centered in the board, that's going to clamp even. If I clamp like this, you can see that this one is wanting to push this way, right? So I use that to my advantage. Of course, I don't want this to drift up. It can't go that way. So I can just bring this little strip all the way down. And when I clamp this, I bias it with that intention of moving that strip toward the stop. Makes sense, yeah? This is solid surface. It's a man-made product, right? And it comes in a thickness of about 1/2 inch or 12 millimeter. Anyway, back when we used to fabricate a bunch of this, the way this is built up to create the thick edge is we would cut strips and we would glue them on like this. We would clamp this in place dry, this build-up strip, right? Then we would use hot melt to adhere these 1-inch thick MDF blocks, spaced out. And then when we went to glue these strips, we had something to index those right against where everything was fairly flush. Of course, we would come back later. This would get trimmed with a router where everything was nice and flush. And these seams virtually are invisible when done correctly. So here's a shot of the front edge of our kitchen countertop, and even though there are 2 seams there, they're virtually invisible. Occasionally, you'll have some particulates that cut right in half, and if you know what to look for, you can see it, but in general, they just disappear. Now the finished ends were done the same way. We would put blocks, say this is upside down, so this would be a finished right-hand side. We'd put blocks and clamp these in place. But inevitably, what would happen, if the guys weren't paying attention, these would drift open slightly and we would get a gap here where you could see a glue line, or even worse, a gap. And so a lot of times we would counter that by adding a bar clamp, but even then it was a little bit of a pain because we would have to make sure that these pieces were exactly the same length. So we could kind of squeeze it together this way. We'd have to put something so the pipe clamp or the bar clamp would adhere to the adhesive that was here in the front and in the back. And it was just kind of a pain. One day I was buying some clamps and I realized that the spring direction was different on 2 different brands. And that made me start to think, a lot of times this glue is really slippery, and we would notice that when you would clamp this, you'd have to bias these clamps, twist them in order to get that favor of direction to make this glue joint tight. Well, when I noticed that the spring direction was different on different brands, I realized that we could use that to our advantage. With glue that's being slippery, as you put this in place, you can see how it biases toward the right, or it twists toward the right, and it would make a very tight seam as that squeezed and twisted in the direction we needed. We would use these on this side, and we would use this left-hand bias on the other side. It worked extremely well. And this was years before, the World Wide Web. It was quite revolutionary for us. And I have to admit, if back then I had introduced this to the solid surface arena, I would have broke the internet. It was that effective. Over the years, okay, let's be real, over the decades, I've had different styles of clamping racks for my F-style clamps, and this is by far my best solution.
They're super easy to make. They're very strong, and I just use scrap plywood, whatever I have available. What I love about this style is that the design is the same. I just change the dimensions for different clamp sizes and even different brands. In my shop, actually in my house as well, I have a unique advantage because I don't have just drywall and sheetrock. There's actually plywood on all the walls, inside and out. It's crazy built. But that way I don't have to have a stud. I don't have to find a stud. I can just hang these anywhere. It's awesome. So recently, when I ended up needing a bunch of edge style clamps, I needed storage for them. And I just made the design of the clamping racks for them the same way. This style works extremely well because of this sloped 15-degree angle, so when you throw a clamp into place, it just slides down the rack and you're done. I've actually been in shops where they have this style of clamp, maybe clamped to a cleat or something, and it's crazy because if you're in a panic, let's say you're doing a glue up in the middle of the summer and it's hot, you don't have time, or I don't want to have time, I don't want to spend time trying to unclamp a clamp so I can use it. I just want to grab it and go. And when I'm done, same thing. I just want to throw it back into place. This design is simple, but even simple can be tweaked, and it has been tweaked over the years, but it's extremely strong, and it cantilevers way out there with the weight of the clamps and zero issues. The angle that these clamping racks come off the wall is 15 degrees. I also add this 15-degree cut on the front of them just so that the clamps engage that part of the platform easier and quicker. I'll show you my rack at the end of the video.
You may remember me sharing these before. Simple 1/4 inch or 6mm plywood, a scrap of leather, a couple of magnets, and with that, right, makes excellent clamping pads. Use them on different clamps. I like that it puts pressure in a focal point here. These have pads on them already, so those are great, but my older ones don't, and so I can utilize those. And I put 2 magnets because sometimes I want it centered, but sometimes I need it offset for that focused clamping pressure. But yeah, simple to make, very effective.
For the last couple of decades, I utilized this U-shaped C-clamp style edge clamp. That's a mouthful. And they worked. They didn't work. They suck. These, however, are incredible. Let me show you more.
One of the cool things about these clamps is that you can manipulate the 2 cams, right, and make this clamp higher by doing something like that. You can see how that clamp is different position than this lower one, or make them equal, and of course it will clamp right in the center. How awesome is that? They're quick and easy. Freaking love these things, man. They start to tighten immediately. As soon as you put it in place, that cam action just grabs and bam, you're set. All right, check it out. This is so much better. Got my edge clamps, right? I have 10 of the big ones, 12 of the smaller ones. I don't use them very often, so I put them up kind of high. My Jorgensen's, these are awesome clamps, but I also don't use those too often, so I tuck those up in there. A few C clamps, also I don't use those very often. These are my most used clamps, and they're easily accessible. I love this style because I can just grab a clamp when I get done. I can just literally throw it into place. I got a bunch of these newer 6-inch, some older 6-inch. These are 12-inch in a medium duty, 12-inch in a heavy duty, 12-inch in a light duty. I've got these other, I think those are 18-inch. I don't remember what brand those are. And I've got some 12 or maybe 8. Bessie clamps, those are awesome, right? couple of my match fit clamps, they'll just sit right there. Vice grip style, right? There's a couple more vice grip style over here, larger. I don't know if they'll show up. Some large squeeze clamps, 4 squeeze clamps here. Then of course I have 3 5-gallon buckets full of these, but I don't need that many very often, so I just keep these handy and I can just get to those right there. I've got one of these for boxes. Yeah, that dude goes right there. Everything is nice and accessible in all one location. Of course, all my pipe clamps are over there. So yeah, so glad I took the time to make these clamp racks.
Well, that's another video down. I sincerely hope you got some useful information out of this. Maybe you found some clamping tips useful, or maybe just another way to make a clamping rack. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you tons if you're subscribed. And if you're not, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button.